I watched my billionaire husband throw me out like trash the day I lost my corporate job. He called me worthless, a burden he could no longer afford to keep. What he didn't know was that I had been hiding a secret worth more than his entire empire. Before we dive into this incredible story of revenge and hidden wealth, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Now, let me tell you about the day my marriage died. There was a time when I thought I had everything figured out. My name is Maya, and just 6 months ago, I was living what most people would call the perfect life. I had a corner office on the 32nd floor of one of Chicago's most prestigious marketing firms, pulling in a 6-figure salary that I'd worked 12 years to earn. Every morning, I'd wake up in our sprawling mansion in Lincoln Park, kiss my husband Robert goodbye, and drive my BMW to work, thinking I was living the American dream. Robert wasn't just any husband either. He was the Robert Chen, the tech billionaire who'd built his empire from a college dorm room. When we met at a charity gala 5 years ago, I thought I'd hit the lottery. Here was this brilliant, successful man who seemed genuinely interested in my mind, my career, my dreams. Our wedding made the society pages, and suddenly I was part of Chicago's elite circle, attending galas, sitting on charity boards, playing the role of the perfect billionaire's wife. But here's the thing about perfect lives. They're usually built on very shaky foundations. I should have seen the warning signs earlier. The way Robert would introduce me at parties, always mentioning my job first, as if my worth was tied to my paycheck. How he'd make little comments about earning your keep or pulling your weight that I brushed off as jokes. The subtle way he'd correct me in front of his business associates, or how conversations would shift when I walked into a room. I told myself it was just the pressure of his business world. Robert was under constant stress, managing a company worth billions, dealing with investors and board meetings. When he'd snap at me for spending too much on groceries or question why I needed a new dress for his company events, I convinced myself he was just being practical. After all, rich people stay rich by watching their money, right? The irony is that I was actually good at my job. Really good. I'd landed major accounts, increased client retention by 30%, and my campaigns had won industry awards. My colleagues respected me, my boss trusted me with the biggest clients, and I genuinely loved the creative challenge of marketing. Work was where I felt most like myself, most confident, most valuable. Then the economic downturn hit our industry like a sledgehammer. Companies started cutting their marketing budgets, agencies began laying off staff, and suddenly my 12 years of experience and proven track record didn't matter. When my boss called me into his office that Tuesday morning in March, I already knew what was coming. The company was downsizing by 40%. Despite my performance, despite my relationships with clients, I was out. Last hired in my department, first to go. I remember sitting in my car in the parking garage after cleaning out my office, holding that cardboard box of personal items, thinking this was just a temporary setback. I had savings, I had connections, I had Robert's support. I'd find something new within a month, maybe even something better. I was Maya Chen now, connected to one of Chicago's most powerful families. Doors would open for me. I had no idea that losing my job would actually lose me everything else too. Because the man I'd married, the man I'd built my life around, was about to show me exactly what he thought I was worth without that paycheck. And it wasn't much. The moment I walked through our front door that evening, I knew something had shifted. Robert was sitting in his leather chair, laptop closed, just staring at me with this expression I'd never seen before. Cold, calculating, like he was looking at a business problem that needed solving. "So," he said, not even bothering with hello, "I heard about your little situation at work today." Little situation. That's what he called the end of my 12-year career. I tried to stay positive, told him about my severance package, my plans to network, how this might actually be an opportunity to find something even better. But with every word I spoke, his face grew harder. "Maya, we need to talk about reality here," he interrupted. "You're 42 years old. The job market isn't exactly friendly to women your age, especially in a shrinking industry. How long do you really think this job search is going to take? The way he said women your age made my stomach turn. This was my husband, the man who used to tell me I was brilliant, beautiful, unstoppable. Now he was talking to me like I was damaged goods. I'll find something, Robert. I have experience, connections, a proven track record. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Connections? Maya, your connections were through your job. Your value was your job. Without it, what exactly do you bring to this marriage? I felt like I'd been slapped. What do you mean, what do I bring? I'm your wife. I love you. I support your career. I manage our social obligations. You spend my money. He cut me off. Your salary barely covered your own expenses. The mortgage, the cars, your shopping, the housekeeper, the landscaping, that all comes from my income. You've been living off me for years without even realizing it. That's when he dropped the real bomb. He was giving me 30 days to find employment. Not just any job, something that would cover my portion of our lifestyle. If I couldn't do that, we'd need to reassess our arrangement. Like our marriage was a business contract. The next few weeks were a nightmare. I sent out dozens of resumes, went on interviews, called every contact in my phone. But Robert was right about one thing. The market was brutal. Companies wanted younger candidates they could pay less, or they wanted someone currently employed. Being the wife of a billionaire actually worked against me. People assumed I didn't really need the job, that I wasn't serious. Meanwhile, Robert grew more distant every day. He started working later, taking calls in his office with the door closed, going on business trips that seemed to pop up suddenly. When I tried to talk to him about my job search, about us, he'd brush me off with comments about being too busy to discuss my situation. Then I found the credit card statements, designer purchases from stores I'd never been to, hotel charges on nights when Robert claimed to be working late at the office, restaurant bills for two at places we'd never eaten together. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. Her name is Jessica, he said, like he was discussing the weather. She's my assistant. Well, was my assistant. Now she's more. I stood there in our kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared coffee every morning for 5 years, and watched my husband calmly destroy our marriage. Maya, you have to understand, I need a partner who can keep up with my life. Jessica understands the business world. She's ambitious, driven, relevant. You've become comfortable, complacent. That's not attractive in a wife. The worst part wasn't even the cheating. It was how he made it sound like it was my fault. Like losing my job had somehow made me less worthy of love, less deserving of respect. Like my value as a human being was tied to my employment status. I want a divorce, I said quietly. I figured you would, he replied, sliding a folder across the counter. My lawyers already drew up the papers. Don't worry, the prenup is very clear about what you're entitled to. Which was almost nothing. I was living in a cramped studio apartment, eating instant noodles for dinner, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize from Atlanta. I almost didn't answer. I'd been dodging calls from Robert's lawyers for weeks. Is this Maya Johnson? The voice was professional, kind. This is Patricia Williams from Williams & Associates Estate Law. I'm calling about your grandmother, Beatrice Johnson. My heart stopped. Grandma B had been out of my life for over 20 years. We'd had a falling out when I was in college, something about family money and priorities that I never fully understood. She'd cut off contact, and I'd been too proud to reach out. I didn't even know she'd died. Ms. Johnson, I'm very sorry for your loss. Your grandmother passed away 3 weeks ago. I've been trying to locate you regarding her will. You're named as her sole beneficiary. Sole beneficiary? That didn't make sense. Grandma B lived in a tiny house in rural Georgia. She'd raised me after my parents died, but we'd never had much money. She worked as a seamstress, clipped coupons, bought day-old bread. I think there might be some mistake, I said. No mistake, Ms. Johnson. Could you come to Atlanta for the reading? There are some significant assets to discuss. I scraped together money for a bus ticket, thinking maybe there was a small life insurance policy or her house to settle. I walked into the law office wearing my last decent dress, feeling completely out of place among the marble floors and expensive artwork. Patricia Williams was a distinguished woman who looked like she handled serious money. She led me into a conference room where 3 other lawyers sat with thick folders. "Ms. Johnson, I need you to sit down for this. Your grandmother was quite wealthy, very wealthy." The room started spinning as she opened the first folder. Real estate holdings across Georgia, Florida, and South Carolina. Apartment complexes, commercial buildings, farmland, properties she'd been quietly buying and developing for 40 years. "Then there's the art collection," Patricia continued, sliding photographs across the table. Paintings I'd never seen, sculptures, rare pieces she'd been acquiring through private dealers. And the investment portfolios. The numbers didn't feel real. $2.8 billion. Billion. With a B. "Your grandmother was quite secretive about her wealth," Patricia explained. "She preferred people to think she was just a simple seamstress. She said it helped her see people's true nature." I sat there, staring at papers that made me richer than Robert could ever dream of being. Richer than his entire family combined. All this time, while he was calling me worthless, while he was throwing me away like garbage, I was inheriting an empire. "There's one more thing," Patricia said gently. "Your grandmother left you a letter." I opened it with shaking hands. In her familiar handwriting, she'd written, "Maya, I know we lost our way, but I never stopped loving you. Use this money to show the world who you really are. Don't let anyone ever make you feel small again." I walked out of that law office a billionaire, but more importantly, I walked out with my power back. I didn't rush into revenge. That's not how real power works. Instead, I spent 3 months quietly assembling the best legal and financial team money could buy. While Robert thought I was probably waiting tables somewhere, I was purchasing his 3 biggest competitors and strategically undermining his market position. The first sign he had that something was wrong came when his stock price started dropping. Then his biggest client suddenly canceled their contract. Then another. I wasn't doing anything illegal, just using my resources to offer better deals than Robert ever could. But I wanted him to see me win. The Children's Hospital Charity Gala was always the social event of the season. Robert would be there with Jessica, playing the happy couple for Chicago's elite. I made sure I was invited too. I walked into that ballroom wearing a custom gown that cost more than Robert's monthly salary used to be. The whispers started immediately. People recognized me but couldn't figure out why I looked so different, so confident, so expensive. Robert saw me from across the room and went completely pale. I watched him excuse himself from his conversation and make his way over, Jessica trailing behind, looking confused. "Maya," he said, and I could hear the shock in his voice. "You look different." "I feel different too," I replied calmly. "Success will do that to a person." That's when I made my announcement. I stood up during the charity auction portion of the evening and pledged $50 million to establish the Beatrice Johnson Foundation for Women's Economic Empowerment. The room erupted in applause. Later, Robert cornered me by the bar, desperate now. "Maya, I made a mistake. We can work this out. I never meant for things to go so far." I looked at this man who had thrown me away when he thought I was worthless, who was now practically begging because he realized what he'd lost. "Robert," I said softly, "you showed me exactly who you are when you thought I had nothing. That's a gift I'll never forget." 6 months later, Robert's company filed for bankruptcy. Mine just went public. And that's how I learned that sometimes losing everything is exactly what you need to find out who you really are. What would you do if you discovered you were secretly worth billions? Let me know in the comments below. If you loved this story of justice and hidden wealth, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible tales. Hit the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Until next time, remember, you never know what secrets people are hiding.
My husband ran out of our anniversary dinner when his mistress called about her sick kid. Meanwhile, I was bleeding in the restaurant bathroom, losing our baby. He chose her fake emergency over our real one. But when I walked away with half his empire, he finally felt my pain. Before I tell you how I made a billionaire beg for mercy, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You're about to hear the most satisfying revenge story of the year. Trust me, you don't want to miss how this ends. Now, let me take you back to where it all started. My name is Nicole Hart, and 3 years ago, I thought I had everything. I was a corporate lawyer at one of the most prestigious firms in Manhattan, on track to make partner before I turned 30. Then I met Christopher Bennett at a charity gala. He was charming, successful, and persistent in all the right ways. He owned Bennett Technologies, a software company worth $500 million, and somehow he chose me, a black girl from Detroit who'd worked 3 jobs to get through law school. He made me feel like I'd finally made it. We got married after a year of dating. It was a fairy tale wedding, the kind you see in magazines. I wore a custom Vera Wang dress, and we honeymooned in the Maldives for 2 weeks. Christopher told me I didn't have to work anymore, that he wanted me to focus on building our family, on being there for him as he grew the company. Like a fool, I believed him. I turned down my partnership. I walked away from everything I'd built because I thought we were building something together. For the first year, things were perfect. Or at least they looked perfect from the outside. We had the penthouse, the vacation homes, the cars that cost more than most people's houses. But Christopher was always working, always on his phone, always somewhere else. Even when he was sitting right next to me, I told myself, that's just what it takes to run a successful company. I told myself I was being supportive. Then I got pregnant. 6 months ago, I took that test and saw those 2 pink lines. And for the first time in months, I felt genuinely happy. I thought this baby would bring us back together, would remind Christopher what really mattered. When I told him, he smiled and hugged me, said all the right things. But that distance between us, it only grew wider. I didn't know about Lauren Phillips then. She was his executive assistant, 28 years old, with blonde hair and blue eyes. The kind of woman who knew how to make herself indispensable. She had a 5-year-old son named Tyler, and she'd mastered the art of the damsel in distress. I'd see her at company events, always hovering near Christopher, always touching his arm, just a little too long when she laughed at his jokes. But I pushed those thoughts away. I wasn't going to be that wife, the paranoid one who saw threats everywhere. The signs were all there, though. Christopher started coming home, later and later. There were more emergency meetings, more investor dinners that I couldn't attend because they were business only. His cologne would smell different sometimes, mixed with a perfume that wasn't mine. He stopped asking about my doctor's appointments. When I'd had complications at 20 weeks and had to go on modified bed rest, he'd nodded absently and gone right back to his laptop. Our 3rd anniversary fell on a Wednesday. I'd made reservations at 11 Madison Park, the restaurant where he'd proposed. I bought a new dress that accommodated my growing belly, got my hair done, put on the diamond earrings he'd given me on our wedding day. I wanted to feel beautiful. I wanted him to see me, really see me, for the first time in months. Maybe I already knew something was wrong. Maybe I was trying to save something that was already gone. Christopher showed up 20 minutes late, still in his suit from the office, barely apologizing. We sat down, and I tried to start a conversation about baby names, about nursery colors, about anything that felt like us, but he was on his phone the entire time, texting, scrolling, his jaw tight with distraction. I watched him across that table, this man I'd given up everything for, and I felt so incredibly alone. Then his phone rang. I saw her name flash across the screen before he could hide it. Lauren. He stood up immediately, walked away from the table to answer it. When he came back, his face was pale, his movements rushed. He said Tyler was sick, that he was being rushed to the hospital, that it was serious. He said he had to go, that he was sorry, that we'd celebrate later. And then he left. He actually left me sitting there, 6 months pregnant, on our anniversary, alone at a table set for two. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The waiter kept asking if everything was okay, if I wanted to order, his eyes full of pity. I couldn't eat, I couldn't think. I just felt this crushing weight in my chest, this certainty that my marriage was over, and I'd been too blind to see it happening. That's when the pain started, sharp and sudden, low in my abdomen. I stood up too quickly, felt wetness between my legs, looked down, and saw blood soaking through my dress. I made it to the bathroom, locked myself in a stall, and saw how much blood there was. Too much blood. Something was very, very wrong. I called Christopher, no answer. I called again, no answer. I called 5 times, left crying voicemails begging him to pick up, telling him I needed him, that something was wrong with the baby. Nothing. I called his driver, his secretary, even his mother. No one could reach him. I was alone in a restaurant bathroom, bleeding, potentially losing our child, and my husband had disappeared for his mistress's kid. Finally, I called 911. The ambulance came, and the paramedics were so kind, so gentle, but all I could think was that Christopher should be here. He should be holding my hand. He should be terrified with me. Instead, I rode to the hospital alone, watching the city lights blur past through my tears, feeling my baby slipping away with every passing minute. The emergency room was chaos. Doctors and nurses rushing around, monitors beeping, someone asking me questions I could barely answer. They got me into a bed, hooked me up to machines, and I heard the words every pregnant woman dreads: fetal distress, significant hemorrhaging, possible placental abruption. They needed to do an emergency ultrasound, needed to assess the situation, needed me to stay calm. But how do you stay calm when you're losing your baby, and the father is God knows where with another woman? My best friend Monica arrived before Christopher did. I'd called her from the ambulance, and she'd dropped everything to be there. She held my hand while the doctor did the ultrasound, while the room got very quiet, while I already knew what they were going to say before they said it. There was no heartbeat. My baby was gone. Our little girl, the one I'd already named in my head, the one I'd dreamed about, was gone. I don't remember screaming, but Monica told me later that I did. I don't remember them sedating me, but I must have needed it. What I do remember is waking up in a recovery room, my body empty, my heart shattered, and my husband still nowhere to be found. It had been 8 hours since he'd run out of that restaurant, and he couldn't be bothered to check his phone. He finally walked in around 3 in the morning. His tie was loose, his hair messy, and I could smell her perfume on him, that sickly sweet floral scent that wasn't mine. He looked surprised to see me there, like he'd forgotten I existed. I told him what happened. I said, I lost the baby, and watched his face barely change. There was a flicker of something, maybe guilt, maybe regret, but mostly he just looked inconvenienced. You know what he said to me? He asked why I didn't call him. After 5 calls, after desperate voicemails, after reaching out to everyone in his life, he had the audacity to ask why I didn't call him. Then he explained, so casually, that Tyler had needed him, that it was serious, that he couldn't just leave a sick child, as if I was being unreasonable, as if I was the problem. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the man I'd married, or maybe it was, and I'd just been too in love to see who he really was. Either way, something broke in me that night. Not my heart, that was already broken. Something harder, something that had been holding me back from seeing the truth. In that hospital bed, empty and alone despite my husband standing right there, I stopped being the woman who sacrificed everything. I started being the woman who would take everything back. The next few days were a blur. There were discharge papers and follow-up appointments and pamphlets about grief counseling. Christopher went back to work after one day. One day, he said the company needed him, that he couldn't just take time off, that we'd get through this. But there was no we. There was just me, alone in our penthouse, grieving a baby he'd barely acknowledged, and a marriage I'd been fighting for by myself. Monica stayed with me. She made sure I ate, made sure I slept, made sure I didn't completely fall apart. And one night, after too much wine and too many tears, she asked me the question I'd been avoiding. Did I really think Christopher had been at the hospital with Tyler that night? Did it really take 8 hours for a sick kid? Shouldn't he have at least checked his phone? I knew the answer. I'd known it the moment I smelled that perfume. But knowing and proving are two different things, so I started digging. I called the hospital, pretended to be following up on Tyler Phillips's emergency visit. The nurse was sympathetic, pulled up the records. Tyler had been seen in the pediatric unit for a mild cold. He'd been there for 2 hours, given some children's Tylenol, and sent home. No emergency, no life-threatening situation. Just a runny nose and a manipulative mother who knew exactly how to get my husband's attention. But 2 hours didn't account for 8. So where had Christopher been? I knew the answer to that too. He had a penthouse downtown. One he claimed was for business meetings and late nights at the office. I'd never been there. He said it was boring, just a place to sleep when he worked late. But I had a key, copied from his keyring months ago when I'd still been trying to trust him. Monica and I went there the next day. The apartment told me everything I needed to know. Women's clothes in the closet, children's toys in the living room, photos on the fridge of Christopher with Lauren and Tyler, looking like a perfect little family. The bed was unmade, and her perfume hung in the air like evidence. He'd been building a whole separate life, and I'd been so focused on saving our marriage that I hadn't seen him destroying it. I took pictures of everything: the clothes, the photos, the receipts I found in the trash for romantic dinners and weekend trips. Then I hired a private investigator, a woman Monica recommended, who specialized in cheating husbands. Within a week, she had a file 2 inches thick. Lauren had been pulling the sick kid routine for months. Every time she needed Christopher's attention, Tyler suddenly had an emergency, an allergic reaction that turned out to be eating too much Halloween candy, a car accident that was actually a tiny scratch on her bumper, a fall that was a scraped knee, and every single time, Christopher dropped everything and ran to her. But when I'd had real complications during my pregnancy, when I'd needed him at my anatomy scan because they'd seen something concerning, when I'd been spotting and terrified at 22 weeks, he'd been too busy. Every single time, he'd been too busy. My real emergencies couldn't compete with her fake ones. Here's the thing about being a lawyer. You learn to read contracts, you learn to find loopholes, and you learn that revenge is best served with ironclad, legal documentation. I pulled out our prenuptial agreement, the one I'd barely read when I'd signed it, because I'd been so in love and so certain we'd never need it. I'd been stupid, but Christopher had been stupider, because that prenup had 2 very important clauses. The first one was standard infidelity voids, certain protections. The second one was rarer, something my father had insisted on when he'd reviewed the contract. Abandonment during a medical emergency constitutes breach of marital duty. Christopher's lawyer had agreed to it because they never thought it would matter. But it mattered now. It mattered a lot. Bennett Technologies had been worth $200 million when we got married. 3 years later, it was worth $500 million. That growth happened during our marriage, which meant it was marital property. The prenup protected Christopher's original assets, but not what we'd built together. And with those 2 clauses, I was entitled to half of everything. I spent the next 3 weeks playing the perfect wife. I smiled when Christopher came home late. I didn't ask questions when he made excuses. I let him think I'd accepted our new normal, that I'd gotten over the miscarriage, that everything was fine. Meanwhile, I was meeting with the best divorce attorney in New York. I was transferring money to accounts Christopher didn't know about. I was building a case that would destroy him. Monica asked me once if I felt guilty, if I felt bad about what I was planning. I didn't, not even a little bit. Christopher had let our baby die while he played house with his mistress. He'd chosen a fake emergency over a real one. He'd made his choice, and now he was going to live with the consequences. The confrontation happened on a Saturday. I invited Christopher home early, told him we needed to talk. I also invited Lauren, telling her Christopher needed his assistant for an important meeting. She showed up in a tight dress and too much makeup, clearly thinking she was there for something else. The look on her face when she walked in and saw me sitting there with my lawyer was priceless. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just played the video my investigator had compiled. Christopher and Lauren at restaurants. Christopher and Lauren leaving his downtown apartment. Christopher and Lauren with Tyler at the park, playing happy family. Then I showed them the hospital records from the night I lost our baby. Tyler's 2-hour visit for a cold. My 8-hour nightmare ending in miscarriage. Side by side. Undeniable. Christopher tried to explain. He said it wasn't what it looked like, that I was overreacting, that yes, he'd made mistakes, but we could work through this. Lauren cried, said I didn't understand, that Christopher had been there for her when she needed him, that Tyler had needed a father figure. I let them talk themselves into a corner, let them pile up the lies, and then I dropped the bomb. I handed Christopher the divorce papers. I watched his eyes scan the pages, watched his face go white when he got to the settlement terms. $250 million, half of Bennett Technologies, the penthouse, the house in the Hamptons, the art collection, everything we'd built, split down the middle. He actually laughed, said I'd never get it, that the prenup protected him. That's when my lawyer explained the infidelity clause, the abandonment clause, the fact that every lie, every fake emergency, every choice he'd made was documented and legally actionable. The look on Christopher's face when he realized what he'd lost was almost worth it. Almost. Lauren left first, suddenly very interested in keeping her distance from a man who was about to lose half his fortune. Christopher tried to negotiate, tried to bargain, tried to convince me that we could save our marriage, but I was done saving things. I was done being the only one fighting. I was done making myself smaller so he could feel bigger. The legal battle lasted 4 months. Christopher tried everything. He tried to hide assets, but my team found them. He tried to claim the company's growth was unrelated to our marriage, but the timeline proved otherwise. He tried to settle for less, but I refused. I wanted everything I was entitled to, and I wanted him to feel the weight of what he'd done. The media got involved, of course. Billionaire tech CEO caught an affair. Abandons pregnant wife during medical emergency. It was tabloid gold. Public opinion turned against Christopher fast. Women's groups rallied around me. Bennett Technologies stock dropped 15%. The board started asking questions. Christopher's perfect life was crumbling, and I had front row seats. Lauren tried to stay with him at first, but when the paternity test I'd insisted on came back, showing that Tyler wasn't even Christopher's child, she disappeared. Turned out she'd been playing the long game, using Tyler as bait to hook a rich man. Christopher had been so desperate to be needed that he hadn't asked basic questions. Within 2 months of the scandal breaking, Lauren was engaged to a hedge fund manager. She'd already moved on to her next target. The court ruled in my favor on every single point. $250 million, paid out over 5 years to protect the company's stability. The penthouse, which I immediately sold. The house in the Hamptons, which I kept. A public apology, which Christopher gave through gritted teeth. And a restraining order, because his attempts to contact me had become harassment. But here's what the money couldn't fix. I'd still lost my baby. I'd still spent years of my life supporting a man who wouldn't cross the street for me when it mattered. I'd still been betrayed in the deepest way possible. The settlement was justice, but it wasn't healing. That came later, and it came differently. I started a foundation 6 months after the divorce was finalized. It provides support for women who've experienced pregnancy loss, especially women whose partners weren't there for them. We offer counseling, financial assistance, legal support, and community. I named it after my daughter, the little girl I'd never gotten to meet, but who'd changed my life anyway. Every woman we help, every life we touch, is her legacy. I also went back to practicing law. Not corporate law this time, but family law. I represent women in divorce cases, especially women whose husbands think they can get away with betrayal and abandonment. I'm very good at my job. I'm very expensive. And I win almost every case I take because I know exactly what it feels like to be on the other side of that table. Christopher tried to apologize about a year after everything was finalized. He showed up at my office, looking older and smaller than I remembered. He said he'd made mistakes, that he'd been selfish, that he'd taken me for granted. He said he wanted another chance, that he'd changed, that he understood now what he'd lost. I listened to the whole speech, and then I told him the truth. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't feel anything for him at all. He was just a man I used to know who'd taught me what I deserved, even if he'd done it by showing me what I didn't. That was 3 years ago. Today, I'm 41 years old, and I've never been happier. I live in a brownstone in Brooklyn that I bought with my settlement money. I run my foundation and my law practice, and I spend my time helping women find their voices and their power. I go on dates sometimes, but I'm not in a hurry to get married again. I've learned that being alone is better than being with someone who makes you feel alone. Christopher's company recovered eventually, though he's no longer the CEO. The board pushed him out after the scandal, and he sold most of his remaining shares. I heard he's dating someone new, another woman who needs saving. I hope she's smarter than I was. I hope she asks the right questions before giving up her life for his. Christopher thought I'd be broken forever. He thought losing the baby and losing him would destroy me. Instead, it freed me. It showed me who I really was, underneath all the compromise and sacrifice. It taught me that I didn't need a man to validate my worth, that I didn't need marriage to feel complete, that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you is actually the thing that saves you. They said I married him for money. Maybe I did. But when I found out my billionaire husband was playing games with our 4-year marriage, I didn't cry. I didn't beg. What I did was so calculated, so cold, that even his lawyers called me a genius. Let me tell you how I won. Before we dive into this story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Trust me, you're going to want to hear how this ends. And drop a comment telling me, would you have done what I did? Now let's get into it. My name is Nicole Grant, and I need you to understand something right from the start. I wasn't some naive girl who stumbled into a billionaire's life. I was a corporate lawyer, 28 years old, pulling in 6 figures at one of the top firms in Manhattan. I had my own money, my own apartment, my own life. So when people assume I married Trevor Sinclair for his billions, they're only seeing half the picture. I met Trevor at a charity gala in 2019. He was 42, newly divorced, and according to Forbes, worth about $3.7 billion from his tech company. I wasn't impressed by the money, though. I was impressed by how he looked at me, like I was the only person in a room full of hundreds, like I mattered. You know that feeling when someone really sees you? That's what I thought was happening. Our relationship moved fast, 3 months of dating, and he proposed on a yacht in the Mediterranean. The ring was ridiculous, 8 carats, but what got me was the handwritten letter he gave me with it. He wrote about how I made him believe in love again, how I was different from everyone else in his world. I said yes because I believed him. God, I really believed him. The wedding was everything you'd imagine. 300 guests, designer dress, coverage in all the society magazines. My mama cried the whole ceremony. And afterward, she whispered to me, "Baby, you made it." And I thought I had. I really thought I had. The first year was beautiful. I won't lie about that. We had homes in New York, Los Angeles, and the Hamptons, private jets, vacation homes in Europe, galas every week. But here's what nobody tells you about being married to a billionaire. The loneliness is suffocating. Trevor was always working, always traveling, always in meetings. I started feeling like an accessory he'd pull out for special occasions. A beautiful black wife to show off at parties, to prove he was progressive and open-minded, but not someone he actually wanted to build a life with. By year 2, I noticed the changes. Trevor started coming home later and later. He'd take phone calls in other rooms and close the door. He stopped asking about my day. We went from making love 3 times a week to maybe once a month, and even then it felt mechanical, like he was checking a box on a to-do list. I tried talking to him about it, but he always had the same excuse. The company was expanding, new contracts, investor meetings, always something. I'm not going to pretend I was perfect either. I started spending more time at charity events, lunches with other wives, anything to fill the emptiness. But I never cheated. I never lied. I held up my end of our vows, even when it felt like I was the only one trying. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March, about 3.5 years into our marriage. I was in Trevor's home office, looking for a file he'd asked me to find. I wasn't snooping, I promise you that. But when I opened his desk drawer, I saw a folder labeled Grant Dissolution. My last name, Dissolution. That's a fancy word for ending something. My hands were shaking when I opened it. Inside was a copy of our prenuptial agreement, but this one was marked up with highlights and notes. Someone had circled the clause about the 5-year mark. See, according to our prenup, if we divorced before 5 years, I'd get $2 million. Not nothing, but not life-changing for someone who'd given up their career and moved their entire life for this marriage. But after 5 years, the amount jumped significantly. We're talking about enough money to set up my family for generations. And there, in the margins, in Trevor's handwriting, were the words, "Execute before year 5. Optimal timeline, month 4. I sat there on the floor of his office, reading that sentence over and over. Execute before year 5. Like our marriage was a business deal that needed to be terminated before it became too expensive. I wasn't a wife to him. I was a liability he was managing. That night, I didn't say anything. I made dinner like always, smiled when he came home late, like always, asked about his day like always, but inside, something had shifted. The woman who believed in love and second chances, she died right there on that office floor. What rose up in her place was someone colder, smarter, and a whole lot more dangerous. I started paying attention to everything. His phone habits, his schedule, the way he talked to certain people. And that's when I noticed Diana. She was Trevor's business partner, 40 years old, blonde, divorced. They'd known each other for 15 years, built the company together from the ground up. I'd always known about her, but I'd never thought twice about their relationship. Now I was watching how they interacted at company events, and I saw it. The lingering touches, the inside jokes, the way she looked at him like she owned him. Because maybe she did. I hired a private investigator. Cost me $15,000 of my own money. Money I'd saved from before the marriage. Within 2 weeks, I had photos of Trevor and Diana having dinner at restaurants in other cities, going to her apartment, leaving together at dawn. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They just thought I was too stupid or too comfortable to notice. But here's where it gets interesting. I didn't confront him. I didn't throw his clothes on the lawn, or key his car, or any of that dramatic stuff you see in movies. Instead, I made a phone call to someone I never thought I'd speak to, Candace, Trevor's first wife. Candace and I met at a small cafe in Brooklyn, far from where anyone in Trevor's circle would see us. She was 51, elegant, and the moment she sat down, she said, "So he's doing it again." Not a question, a statement. Turns out, Trevor had pulled the same move on Candace, married her, played the devoted husband for 4 years, then divorced her right before their 5th anniversary. She got the minimum from the prenup, and 6 months later, he married wife number 2. They lasted 4 years too. Then wife number 3, same pattern. Marry them, string them along until just before the money gets serious, then trade them in for a younger model. I was wife number 4, and I'd nearly made it to the finish line. Candace looked at me across that table and said, "Don't let him win, baby. You're smarter than I was. You're younger than I was. You can still fight this. So I did. But not the way anyone expected. I went back to school, so to speak. I studied everything about Trevor's company, his finances, his business structure. I still had my law license, still had my brain. I started attending board meetings as his wife, asking innocent questions, taking notes. I made friends with his accountant, his lawyers, even his mother, who'd never particularly liked any of his wives, but seemed to respect that I was at least trying to understand the family business. And then I found it. The thing Trevor had been hiding from everyone, including the IRS offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell corporations, money being moved around in ways that were, let's just say, not exactly legal. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in potential tax fraud. I documented everything, every transfer, every shell company, every suspicious transaction. I made copies of files he kept in his office. I recorded conversations where he discussed these accounts with Diana. Thinking I was too busy planning charity galas to pay attention, I built a case against my own husband that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. But I still didn't show my hand. Not yet. Month 3 of year 4 rolled around. Trevor started acting strange, nervous. He was preparing to drop the divorce bomb. I knew it. He'd probably planned some speech about how we'd grown apart, how he'd always care about me, all that garbage cheating men say when they're trying to make their betrayal sound noble. I beat him to it. It was our 4th anniversary party. Trevor had insisted on throwing this massive celebration at our Hamptons estate. 200 guests, full catering, live band. Everyone who was anyone in New York society was there. He thought he was being generous, giving me one last moment in the spotlight before he cut me loose. Halfway through the party, I asked the band to pause. I took the microphone and said I wanted to make a toast to my incredible husband. Everyone raised their glasses, smiling. Trevor looked proud, unsuspecting. And then I started talking. I thanked him for 4 amazing years. I thanked him for teaching me so much about business and finance. I thanked him for introducing me to Candace, his first wife, who'd been so helpful in explaining his patterns. You should have seen the color drain from his face. I thanked Diana for being such a dedicated business partner, so dedicated that she barely left his side, even at 3 in the morning. People started looking around, confused, sensing the shift in energy. Then I said, but most of all, I want to thank you, Trevor, for being so predictable. See, everyone here thinks this is our anniversary party, and it is, but it's also my liberation party. I handed him an envelope. Inside were copies of everything I'd found. The offshore accounts, the tax evasion, the fraudulent business practices. Also inside was a new set of divorce papers, drawn up by my attorney, with terms that were very different from what Trevor had planned. I told him he had 2 choices. Option 1, we go to court, I present all this evidence to the IRS and the FBI, and he spends the next decade in legal battles that will drain his billions and probably land him in prison. Option 2, he signs my papers, gives me what I'm asking for, and I keep quiet about his illegal activities. What was I asking for? $50 million, the Hamptons house, and a public statement that our divorce was mutual and amicable, with no mudslinging on either side. The room was silent. You could hear champagne bubbles popping in glasses. Trevor looked at Diana, but she had already backed away from him, smart enough to know a sinking ship when she saw one. He looked at his lawyers, who'd gone pale. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in years, he saw who I actually was. Not a trophy, not a fool, a worthy opponent. He signed the papers that night. The divorce was finalized 6 weeks later. Fastest billionaire divorce in New York history. Trevor's team tried to negotiate down the amount, but my lawyers reminded them about the federal crimes we had documented. Suddenly, $50 million seemed like a bargain. Diana, by the way, left the company 3 months later. Turns out, the board had lost faith in both of them once rumors of their affair started circulating. Trevor tried to buy her out, but she sued him for breach of contract. Last I heard, that case is still ongoing. No loyalty among thieves, I guess. As for me, I took that 50 million, and I did something Trevor never expected. I started a foundation for women going through difficult divorces, especially women of color who don't have access to good legal representation. I help them find lawyers, document financial abuse, protect their assets. I've helped 43 women in the last year walk away from bad marriages with their dignity and their fair share intact. I also wrote a book about financial literacy and protecting yourself in marriage. It hit the bestseller list in 3 weeks. Trevor's lawyers tried to block it, claiming it violated our confidentiality agreement, but my lawyers reminded them that the agreement said I couldn't discuss his illegal activities. The book doesn't mention them at all. It just tells women how to be smart, how to watch for warning signs, how to protect themselves. All legal, all ethical. My mama asks me sometimes if I regret marrying Trevor. The honest answer is no. Those 4 years taught me something valuable. They taught me that love without respect is just pretty words and empty promises. They taught me that being underestimated is actually an advantage if you're smart enough to use it. And they taught me that a black woman with a plan is unstoppable. People still talk about me in those society circles. Some call me a gold digger who got lucky. Others call me a genius who played the game better than anyone expected. I don't really care what they call me. I know what I am. I'm a woman who refused to be played, who turned the tables on a man who thought he could use me and discard me like I was nothing. Trevor's still a billionaire, still running his company, though his reputation took a major hit. We don't speak, obviously, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that he tells people I was the one who got away. That's rich, considering he was planning to throw me away. But men like Trevor rewrite history to make themselves feel better. I let him have that. I don't need him to admit what he did. I know the truth. And more importantly, I won. So that's my story. 4 years of marriage, 6 months of planning, and one move that changed everything. Now I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, was I wrong for what I did? Would you have walked away or fought back? And if this story taught you something, do me a favor and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Hit that like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and remember, never let anyone play games with your life.